compare the progressive era to the age of reform, but we're going to focus initially on this age of reform. Now, the big ideas you got to take away, you know, or when you think about the age of reform, which is the 1830s, 1840s, is that this was spurred on by the Second Great Awakening and new ideas that are coming in from Europe. There's this idea or this desire to work towards this perfect society. So we're trying to get perfection within society. That idea first starts with the Second Great Awakening, but then we're going to find it in, you know, in other ways. And people are going to start looking at themselves as a tool to improve society, not necessarily looking for the government to do it, not looking for other people to do it, but they're looking at, you know, within themselves saying, we can make society better if we start working now. And started with Second Great Awakening, but you're going to see it move in with like the Transcendentalists and stuff like that as well. You're going to see, like I said, it's not the government who's going to be doing this in the 19th century. It's going to be groups. It's going to be women. It's going to be, you know, the abolitionists. It's going to be churches. It's going, you know, all these groups are going to come together and say, what can we do to improve society? So those are the big ideas coming into it. When we talk about the Second Great Awakening, very similar to the First Great Awakening, the concern was there was this lack of passion about religion during the 1830s and 40s. You had some new movements that had been introduced, the idea of deism and Unitarianism, where, you know, it's basically saying you don't need God or anything like that to survive or to be saved or anything. And so that's going to spur this discussion, and which will grow into the Second Great Awakening in America. Now, it starts in the New York region. It's called the Burned Over District, was a nickname for it. Charles Finney is the primary leader of the Second Great Awakening, but it spreads throughout the entire country. And just like the First Great Awakening, we're going to see, you know, camp meetings and traveling pastors and stuff like that going from town to town. And they're going to start sharing this message that it's not so much, remember, they're going to shift from Calvinism, and now they're going to look more at Arminianism, where it's not a predestination, it's your choice whether or not you choose salvation. And so that's the message that's going to be preached during this time. There'll be new religious groups that are going to evolve from this. The Baptists have been around, but they're going to grow bigger and stronger. The Methodists as well. Other new religions, Mormonism gets its start during this time period. And what it's about is this personal relationship with God and a personal conversion, that you have to make this choice. And with that choice evolves the idea of democracy within the church, that each individual makes their own decision for themselves. Each individual builds their own relationship with God. And then that will grow into society where each individual can now contribute to society and make changes. And we saw a lot of emotionalism with this as well. And, you know, this is where that idea of born again comes from, is from during the Second Great Awakening. You're going to see, like I said, this increase in evangelism, this growth of this religious fever in our country. That's going to lend to the reform movement and give it the fuel to grow in its own right. So the Second Great Awakening, that's your foundation of this reform movement. Now, when we get into the age of reform, they're going to be looking at different parts of society. Who can, you know, where can we make improvements of society? Again, trying to get to that level of perfectionism. Several different ones I'm going to talk about, but here's basically a list of the reform movements of the 19th century. They're on the left. And the reform movements of the 20th century, or the progressive era, they're on the right. And some are similar, some are different, some are evolutions of the original. For instance, the temperance movement is going to evolve into the prohibition movement. The women's movement is going to evolve into the women's suffrage movement. So there are roots of the progressive era in the age of reform, and that's why they're very easy to talk about in the same conversation. Okay, let me get this here. All right, let's look at a few of these reform movements, see what we got. The first one is education. This is going to be led by a man by the name of Horace Mann. Horace Mann was the Secretary of Education for the state of Massachusetts, and what he's looking to do is to expand the school system, not only expand curriculum, but get more schools out there and make school compulsory, make school required for kids to go to. And you're going to see he's going to introduce longer school terms where, at one point school only lasted like 5 or 6 months out of the year because of the farming calendar and stuff like that. He's going to try to extend the school year. He's going to, like I said, expand the curriculum, beyond just, reading and writing. They're going to add math in there. They're going to add science in there, and all these different new ideas are going to come into the curriculum. The goals, though, of education. The first goal I want to talk about is this installation of Republican ideas. And this ties to the women's movement as well, because up until the 19th century, people's kids got schooled at home, the original homeschoolers, and it was the women teaching. That was part of their responsibility. And that's where we got that idea of Republican motherhood, that women were instilling Republican ideas and virtues into kids so they would grow up to be good citizens, especially the boys. Well, now Horace Mann says, no, we need to be doing that in the public schools. So this idea of civic education is now going to shift from the home to the schools. On top of that, he wants, to teach discipline and to teach the value of hard work. And so we're seeing this reform of the education system away from the home into public schools. Now, it's much more beneficial for people in the North. And that's primarily because in the South, because of the landscape, because of the economy, you have a plantation-based lifestyle and economy. And though only about 20-25% of the people in the South actually owned a large plantation, that's still, they're still the driving political force, they're still the driving social force of the Southern economy. And so most of the people in the South, if they're going to be educated, it's going to be through private tutors. And the only ones who can afford those private tutors are going to be the wealthy. So you're going to have a lot of people in the Southern states not being, not open, but or public school not being available to them because it's, it's not the way that they've set up their society. So the Northern states are absolutely going to benefit more from public education than the Southern states, and that's going to change over time, obviously. But in the beginning, that's the structure. The temperance movement, the whole idea of not drinking, and the temperance movement is a little bit different than the prohibition movement because they're not looking to outlaw alcohol. They're not looking to the government to shut it down. They're looking to the individual to make the right choice, to choose to abstain from alcohol, to choose, to focus on their family. A lot of that is coming from this idea of the growth of the factory system because we're in the second industrial revolution and factories are growing. Family life is very important. And so, a good employee will go to work and work hard and then go straight home and spend time with his family. He's not going to stop at the bar or the saloons on the way home. You also had an immigration tie to the temperance movement because during the 1830s and 40s, that's when the first wave of immigrants is coming into our country. That's the Irish and the Germans. And there was a lot of characterization of those people being drinkers. And so part of the education reform was to Americanize immigrants. Part of the temperance movement is to socialize immigrants into this idea of family first, and, abstaining from drinking. And so that's another movement of the temperance movement. Now, the organization that comes out of it is the American Temperance Union. And like I said, their propaganda was to stay dry, not legally, just by personal choice. You're going to see the shift going into the 20th century where we go from temperance to prohibition, where they say, now we want it to become a law. Now we want the government to regulate alcohol in our country. And that's going to lead to the passage of the 18th Amendment and the smashing of all the alcohol. All right, the women's movement. Now, the women's movement had a tough row to hoe at the beginning because they're growing out of the common man movement, the age of common man. 1830s, that's Jackson's presidency. And we know he got elected through the common man, Jacksonian democracy, more people are voting. And yet women did not fall under that common man principle. Like I told you, women's role has started to change in society. They were, I think, honestly, in the 18th century, coming out of the American Revolution, I think women were more valued in society versus the 1800s, because the women were responsible for that Republican education in the 18th century. So that Republican motherhood. Well, that has now evolved into the cult of domesticity, where the women's sphere of influence is in the home, but that influence is maintaining a happy family, not educating, but keeping everyone happy within the family. Because let's be honest, happy family means happy husband, means happy worker. And that's kind of what they're looking at. And that's what they looked for women to do, to keep the family unit together and to keep it happy and moving forward. Now, women are also, in this women's movement, they're going to be inspired by the Second Great Awakening, because the Second Great Awakening introduced democracy in the church and democratic ideals. So you're going to see women step up and say, we can make, we have a voice, and we can also make a change in society. We don't have just influence in the home. We can have influence to make society better too. And that's where you see not just the women's movement get started, but the abolition movement get started, the temperance movement get started, the mental health movement gets started. So all of that, grows out of, like I said, from the beginning, the Second Great Awakening. The one thing you need to know that you need to pull out of this time period for the women's movement is the Seneca Falls Convention in 1848. Guys, this is a date you have to know. There's a very good chance that you might see a question about the evolution of women in politics. And if you don't know 1848 and the Seneca Falls Convention, it's going to come back and bite you. But we know at the Seneca Falls Convention, the women came together and they drafted the Declaration of Sentiments. This was modeled after the Declaration of Independence, but it includes women now. And that's going to be the launch pad for the women's movement going forward, is that Declaration of Sentiments. Now, unfortunately for women during this time, their movement is going to be completely overshadowed, because if you think 1848, Seneca Falls Convention, we're going right into the 1850s, and the 1850s was all about the question of slavery, the expansion of slavery, the power of the government in determining what states would have slaves and not have slaves. And that's when the abolition movement took off. Uncle Tom's Cabin came out, and the abolition movement is going to totally overshadow the women's movement. In fact, we even talked about in class how the women stepped back going into the 1860s and 70s, because they recognized the importance of bringing slavery to an end in our country. So they're going to kind of go onto the back burner of society, and they're going to allow abolitionists to run. But remember, when we get to the 1870s, in 1870, when the 15th Amendment is ratified, which gives the freedmen the right to vote, women are going to be upset, and they're going to be angry that they've once again been left behind, even though they were propping up that movement since the 1840s. So they don't get a lot accomplished in the 1800s, and a lot of it is because in the hierarchy of reform movements, they're more towards the bottom, where abolition is right up there at the top. So Transcendentalism, this is a new idea that's going to be introduced during the 1830s and 40s, kind of like how Enlightenment influenced the 1700s going into the fight for independence. Transcendentalism is going to influence society as we move further into the 1800s, because Transcendentalists believe this idea that truth above all is the most important thing, and truth can be found within each one of us. We each have this inner light where within ourselves we can find the truth, and we have the responsibility to share that truth. And kind of working parallel to the Second Great Awakening, we need to use that for the betterment of society. Some major players in this is Ralph Waldo Emerson is considered the father of the Transcendentalist movement. He is going to teach the idea of self-reliance, self-improvement, with the goal of improving society and the freedom that we have to do that. His number one student was Henry David Thoreau. Thoreau is going to introduce us to this idea of civil disobedience, where if we see a law that we feel is wrong, it's our duty and our responsibility to break that law, willing to accept the punishment for breaking the law. But that's what we need to do to draw attention to the failure of that. And again, that will help move us towards a better, more improved society. Now, there's going to be groups of people who take this transcendentalist field of thought and say we can make our own society and we can prove that transcendentalism and everything is the right way to go. And so we're going to see these versions of utopian societies start to spring out. Now, the Mormons actually tried, I'm not going to put them in the transcendentalist under that umbrella, but they believed in a communal style of living. And so that's going to kind of mirror what you're seeing going on with these utopian societies, such as Brooks Farms or New Harmony or the Oneida communal living. It's where they, like the Brooks Farm brought transcendentalist ideas, and they're saying we're going to live this transcendentalist lifestyle and prove that society can be perfect, and we can build the perfect society with that. The New Harmony is going to add socialism to that model. The problem with all of these utopian societies is that in their attempt to build a perfect society, they didn't think of the fact that they're trying to build a perfect society with human beings who are inherently imperfect. So they're not going to work, but you can see the train of thought and what they're trying to do and how they're trying to implement these new ideas that are coming out of this age of reform. So that's going to take us to a point. That's just a real quick overview of some of these reform movements. And that's going to take us to this point where I want to start comparing it to progressivism and looking at it a little bit more linear and a little, and create some sort of structure to how we should study this. So before I share the next thing with you, do you guys have any questions about anything I just talked about or anything I might not have talked about? Nothing's coming up. So I am going to, oh wait, what year was this? Which one? For the whole, if you're talking about the entire age of reform, we're going 1830s through 1840s into the 1850s. And then abolition will continue beyond that. When we talk about the progressive era, we're talking late 1890s, and we're going to go into about 1918 with the progressive era, okay? So let me get here. New share. Okay. All right. Can everybody see this worksheet I have in front of you? This comparative reform movements. Give me a couple nods. Or okay, good. Okay. So what I have here is this is an opportunity for us to sit down and actually I created this graphic organizer that will help you study the comparison of reform across a period of time. So with this worksheet, it goes from the age of reform, so 1830s, all the way up into the New Deal, which is about 1941. And so this is, I'm going to share this, I'm going to talk briefly about populism in here. I'm not going to go in depth in it right now. But this form I am going to share with you after this class is over. I'm going to put it on Google Classroom for everyone to see. But what I want to do is I want to start working through it with you together right now. You don't necessarily have to write anything down because like I said, this form is going to show up in your Google Classroom as soon as we're done here. So what we're going to do though is we're going to start filling this out together. And for us to do that, what you guys are going to have to be willing to do is turn your microphone on and answer some of these questions. And I don't need this, you don't have to turn your cameras on or anything like that. I'm not going to call on you, but I'm going to ask for input for you guys to help me fill this form in. So we're going to focus first on the antebellum reform, the age of reform. And what I want someone to tell me is basically what was the focus? What started the antebellum age of reform?
Like religion?
Religion more specifically?
The Second Great Awakening?
Yeah, the Second Great Awakening. Whoops, you're going to see all my typos as I do this. And what were they trying to do? What was the ultimate goal for society?
Reconnect with religion?
Reconnect with religion, but beyond that, once they reconnected with religion, what is that going to do for society as a whole?
Like make people better people?
Yeah, exactly. So it's going to make society as a whole because we're trying to reach a level of perfection is what we're trying to do. And so that's kind of the foundational idea here. And my other question about this is who was responsible or who was basically in charge of doing all this? Is there one person or is it a group or is it, So if I was going to ask you, we're sitting in class, I'm like, okay, the Second Great Awakening introduced us to this idea that we want to create this perfect society. Who is responsible for creating a perfect society?
Is it the individual?
Yeah, absolutely. It's the individuals, and it's more based on, you know, the local level. It's not like you're not seeing it as this big huge national movement, although some of these movements do go to a national level, but you start on more of a local level, and you grow out from there. Okay, so that's kind of how we're going to work this. So when we get down to the sub movements, what I mean here is what are some of the movements that came out of this time period, out of the age of reform. So just give me some of the movements.
The women's movement.
Okay.
Abolition.
Educational reform.
Temperance.
I'm sorry.
Temperance.
I'm spelling stuff wrong, so just okay.
Transcendentalism.
Yeah, the hardest one. All right. Any others? There's one I didn't talk about.
Oh, prison reform?
Yeah, prison reform, and mental health. That they both kind of fell under together. Mental health.
Hey, you spelled transcendentalism, right?
I got that one. Temperance, I always mess up. I don't know why I have trouble with that word. So, okay, good. All right, now, what people? I didn't really talk about a whole lot of people, hardly any at all. So, but can you remember some people that were involved in some of these reform movements?
Emerson.
Horace Mann
Emerson, Horace Mann.
and Thoreau with Emerson.
Yep. Ah,
Who's the hatchet lady?
the hatchet lady is actually, she was the progressive era. What was her name?
Oh.
Carrie Nation.
Yeah.
Carrie Nation. I'm going to go ahead and put her over here. But yeah, absolutely. That's a name you should know. What others?
Susan B. Anthony.
Yep. Okay.
This is the Jonah too.
So, yep.
Dorothea Dix.
Okay. Let's see.
What about the former slave dude?
The
Booker
former
T. Washington.
Booker T. Washington, a little bit later, because why wouldn't, well, actually, Booker T. Washington's over here. There is another former slave dude that goes into the age of
Frederick
reform.
Douglass.
Yeah.
And then
Thank you.
wouldn't it also be like Joseph Smith and some of those people?
Yeah,
They were
absolutely. So let me
like
put.
the Beechers and stuff.
Uh-huh. Douglas, features. Joseph. All right, that's good. All right, so you're kind of you're catching on. This is cool. Organizations. What organizations were formed during the age of reform?
The Mormon Church.
Okay.
Women's Temperance Union, is that what it is?
Yep.
Or Women's Christian Temperance Union?
Actually, it was just was it? I think it's just women's temperance, and it becomes Christian temperance movement in the progressive era.
Oh, okay.
Either way, and look, I still spell. Why can't I spell this word right? All right. What else? Talk
Were the
about-
labor unions back then?
I'm sorry, Alyssa.
Were the labor unions back then as well?
The labor unions. When did those really come about? What spurred those?
The Gilded Age.
Yeah, the Gilded Age. So they're going to come after, but they will be over here in the progressive era. So you're thinking the right thing.
They weren't new, but the Methodist and the Baptist churches
Yeah,
like popped off.
they grew absolutely.
The Anti-Slavery Society?
Yeah, what was it called?
The Anti-Slavery Society.
Okay, so the Anti-Slavery Society. There was also another one that dealt with abolition. A big one. It was what their, let me see. They wanted they wanted to free the slaves, but they didn't want the freedmen to stay here.
Oh, the one that wanted to send them to Liberia or whatever, right?
Right. And what do you remember the name of it?
No.
I'll type it slow.
Did it start with an N?
No.
The American color.
Colonization.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Oops, sorry.
Is that right in here?
The American Colonization Society. I spelled that wrong. You guys remember who was in charge, or well,
Marcus Garvey.
Marcus Garvey. Well, Marcus Garvey was the the American Colonization Society is actually going to start in the 1830s, 1840s. The idea is going to carry over to the progressive era, and that's when Marcus Garvey comes in. And do you remember the name of his ships that he was going to use? What the ship line was called?
Is it Black Star?
It sure is, yeah.
Let's go.
All right. If I said the name William Lloyd Garrison, what would that make you think of?
The North Star.
The Liberator.
The
Liberator.
Crap.
But who was the North Star?
Oh God.
We
No,
got-
wait. That was Frederick Douglass's.
Yes, absolutely. All right, cool. We got it there. All right, so there you go. So that's kind of how this is working and everything, and you're already seeing some carryover and some comparisons over to the progressive era. Now, when the progressive era started, someone already mentioned it. It was due to the Gilded Age, and what in the Gilded Age kind of led us to the progressive era? What were some of the problems, or what were the big ideas that had to be fixed?
Child labor.
Okay.
Basic, like bad working conditions in general.
And, like
Okay.
just worker abuse.
Exactly. Yeah. So it was more work conditions,
Bless you.
industrialization, and then what else? Oh my gosh, industrialization. Get it. What else? Because it wasn't just worker reform that happened during the progressive era. I mean, what were some of the? Let's look. What were some of the movements that came in the progressive era?
Was conservation one, or was that later?
No, that's absolutely one.
Prohibition.
The like the food and all the stuff relating to the food.
Okay.
The bad food.
Yeah, bad food. I'm sorry.
The meat processing.
Yeah, the meat, the processing. So I don't even know what we would call that, but I mean we can go down here, and one of the outcomes, I didn't put any outcomes on here, but what we could put the meat packing act.
Meat
Okay.
Inspection Act.
Meat inspection. Thank you.
Food
then
and Drug Administration.
Pure Food and Drug Act.
Okay. Okay. Other movements during this time?
Women's suffrage.
Women's suffrage. So yeah.
Civil rights movement.
Yep. Now,
Like,
interesting civil rights movement. I do want to touch on that briefly, because what I find interesting is during the Age of Reform, you had the women's movement that was completely overshadowed by the abolition movement. And I think we have a little bit of a switch when we get into the progressive era, because you do have a civil rights movement, but I think it's overshadowed by the women's suffrage movement, because one of the big things that, there were some complaints about, and actually this was one of your exam questions at one point, was that the progressives, while they made a whole lot of changes in society, they really didn't do much for the African American, because we were still in segregation. We're still under Plessy versus Ferguson. You can still, if you remember the PowerPoint, that slide of the big, huge KKK march in Washington, D.C. and all that other stuff going on. So while there was absolutely a civil rights movement, because you had Booker T. Washington, you had Marcus Garvey, the actual changes for African Americans during this time were very minimal. So the progressives kind of dropped the ball when it came time for African Americans. So, all right, what else?
like, I don't know if it really counts as like a sub movement, but like eugenics with like Margaret Sanger.
Yeah, no, that's because and that kind of ties back to this movement, this idea that got started during the age of reform of this trying to make society better. And that's what all of this is doing. If you want to, want an overarching umbrella between the progressive movement and the age of reform from 1830 all the way to 1918 or even 1941, we're trying to make society better. And we have different views on how that will happen, but it's absolutely, a driving force.
Did you put socialism on there?
Nope, but I can. All right, good. One thing, someone asked me if I was going to talk about a political movement, but this is going to come out of the Gilded Age as well, because there was political reform during the Progressive Era. So where did that grow out of?
Like the Grangers and all of them.
Yeah, and populism. That's going to be another movement. Whereas when we looked at the age of reform, we're honestly looking primarily at social change. But when we get to the progressive era, we're looking just at social change, but also political change. So all of that's going to come in. When we talk about people, you have a few. There's one big group of people that you should probably list here for the progressive era. They're the ones who told us we were having a hard time.
Oh, like muckrakers.
Yeah. I gotta make sure I spell this right. It's the first part I worry about. So, all right. Any names you can think of here? Think of any other names we could throw in here for women, muckrakers,
Ida
whatever.
Upton
Tarbell.
Sinclair.
Upton.
Good. What about women? You know any of the women's movement people?
We don't care about women.
Is it like Katie Stanton?
Katie Stanton is primarily is going to be over here, but we're going to add her.
I have absolutely no clue.
That's okay. I gave you a name. Alice Paul is one. Trying to think if there's anybody else you should know. Oh, politically, who made changes?
Teddy Roosevelt, Taft, and Wilson.
Yeah. All right, cool. Organizations that formed during this time?
Labor unions.
Okay. Can you give me a specific?
Like the ATL or whatever it was.
AFL. AFL.
What was the Eugene V. Debs one? The IWW?
IWW. Whoops. ISS. No, IWW. All right, cool.
And then also the anti-labor groups like the Pinkertons.
Yeah.
They're a bad group.
What's that?
The bad groups like the KKK.
Yeah. I mean, they absolutely that they're part of it as well. So, you got to include that. And then obviously if we're, progressive era, you're going to see the Progressive Party established here as well. Okay. All right. We kind of hit a couple of things, the effectiveness, the Meat Inspection Act, the Pure Food and Drug Act. Can you give me an example of any political change?
Direct election of senators.
Okay. So which amendment is that?
17. And then also 16 with the income tax.
Yep. So I'll just put 16, 17.
What about like referendums and recalls? When was that?
That's exactly, that's what, yeah, absolutely. Initiative, referendum, and recall.
The 18th and 19th amendments fall under progressive, right?
Yep.
Also, no, I guess it wouldn't bimetallism. Was that this time period?
It is this time period, but I don't know if I'd put it under effectiveness. I might.
It like ended bimetallism as like a
but
problem.
But I think I would put it maybe the movement itself. I would put it under a movement. But you're right. We actually end it and we get rid of it at that point. All right,
And
you
then
guys.
back,
I mean, go ahead.
Wouldn't like the effect be like, or of this in general, just be like trust got broken up and stuff like Standard Oil?
Absolutely, yeah. Because you had antitrust laws like the Sherman Antitrust Act is going to come out during this time. Okay, so yeah, you guys did pretty well on this. We got quite a bit of information on there. But you can see how it's going to work. Now, I didn't do anything over here. We didn't do anything with the New Deal. This is where you're going to maybe have to go on your own and use this. This is not something I'm going to collect or anything like that. I'm going to share it with you so you can use it as a tool to help prepare for the exam. If you have, even, half of all of this on that sheet, plus some stuff from the New Deal, and you get a question about, the evolution of society or the reform of society over a certain time period, you could go right to this. This is the kind of stuff you want to have available for you, in the quote open note style of testing that we have. So, okay. All right. Like I said, I will share this with you, and I'm going to share exactly what you guys said. And I'll add some other things in there that we didn't, from the other class. So you have a good working 2 columns there for antebellum and the progressive. But my question is, do you guys have any questions for me?
For the progressive era, could you include like what do you call it? Like taking tests in order to be a government official?
Civil reform. That'd be civil
Yeah.
reform, like the
Service exam.
yeah, the civil service exam. That was the Pendleton Act. The Pendleton Act, that was actually passed during the populist era. You could absolutely talk about it, though. It kind of, if you're going to put it somewhere, I would kind of put it in a line in between these two because it's kind of a connection. But absolutely, civil service testing is definitely something that was a reform that did happen. So. Okay. Anything else, guys?